Hi everyone, welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Wednesday the 13th, right before spring break. So I hope you enjoyed watching Much Ado About Nothing. It's a very different kind of performance than what we saw with A Midsummer Night's Dream. A Midsummer Night's Dream being in the Globe Theater. Even though they took some liberties, it gave you a good sense of what watching a live performance might be like. Of course, we get the advantage of seeing through a camera lens, so we get to see things like close ups of actors' faces in a way we never would if we were seated in the Globe Theater. And Much Ado About Nothing is a very different kind of production. It's very Hollywood. It tries to be epic. And Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson are two main leads playing Beatrice and Benedict. I think are excellent in terms of their performances. At the time, they were actually married when they put on that particular performance. They divorced afterwards and now no longer will work with one another, unfortunately. But I think you can see and feel the chemistry between the two. It's one of the great interesting things about the play, and there are many interesting things about the play, that we're supposed to be focused on Hero and Claudio, but the reality is that it's Benedict and Beatrice who steal the show. And I did want to talk a little bit about Much Ado About Nothing. And also just looking at our syllabus because of that snow day that we had, wanted to give you an extension for the first paper. So now your first paper would be due the 27th of March, which is a Wednesday. So that's an additional class. So that said, you could certainly hand in a paper early. As I had indicated, I've got rolling due dates for papers. But by this point, we would have passed by our spring break, so we're more than halfway through the semester, so it would be a good idea to have a paper in at that point. And of course, you have the option of rewriting that first paper. Once I return it to you, please send it to me via PDF to my email, because that's how my grading program works best. And my email is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. But once I evaluate it and I return it back to you, then if you wanted to, you could revise it for a higher grade, incorporating my suggestions into your revision. I just ask that you submit in your revision along with ultimately your original copy with my comments so that I can compare and contrast the two. You'd get the higher of the two grades, and ultimately you would have up until the ending of the semester to submit that, but the earlier the better for everybody involved. So in terms of the performance that we saw with Much Ado About Nothing, and all of the performances that we will be watching this semester, as you know, performance is never a substitute for reading. It's a supplement to reading. So I very much hope that at this point in the semester, you have finished reading Much Ado About Nothing, and you have begun our next play, which might be the most challenging play of the semester, Richard II, where we move from comedies to basically a history play. And history plays talk a little bit about British history and dramatize British history. So sometimes they follow British history and sometimes they take creative liberties. So while it's useful to know the history, sometimes it can also be somewhat limiting if you're expecting a verbatim account, because that's not what you're going to get at all. And I'll talk a little bit about the genre of history plays when we return from spring break. But I encourage you to begin reading Richard II now. The performance we're going to be watching is another take on Shakespeare. This is from the BBC, and basically they underwent an very interesting and ambitious project in the 1970s and 1980s to try to put on all of Shakespeare's plays, all 30 plus, as close as possible to the text. So just about verbatim. So if you're looking for a version of Shakespeare's plays that pretty much is word for word, then that would be the BBC version. And because Richard II tends to be a complicated play, the history plays in general tend to be complicated. They're longer plays and they have a lot of dialogue. I thought it would be useful for us to see the BBC version, which we should be able to stream through the GCC library, and not have to go through some of the contortions we went through to be able to watch the Globe production. This is something that is available to all students. So I will give you access to that when we return from the break. But of course, now what you're concentrating on is Much Ado About Nothing. And there really was much ado about nothing. There was a lot of rumor and a lot of hearsay about the possibilities of infidelity. Of course, if you think about the time of the Renaissance and the importance of virginity, especially for female, I think this play really illustrates that. And one of the reasons why I wanted to give Much Ado About Nothing is because it's very much set in reality, as opposed to Midsummer Night's Dream, which is very much set in a world of fantasy. And Much Ado About Nothing is really the comedic version of Othello, a tragedy that we will be reading in our tragedy section. So in many ways, this play will lay the foundation to what we will be seeing with Othello. In other words, this play can get rather dark. But because Much Ado About Nothing is a comedy, we know that it has to end well, and that means no death and marriage or the promise of marriage. And nothing could also be a slang term for a sexual organ, and of course, we know Shakespeare, his winks and nods with his body references. So, in the first act, when we are introduced to characters and settings and conflicts, the men folk are returning from war and they're coming to Messina, Italy. And Kenneth Branagh took great advantage, the director as well as the star of the movie, by being able to shoot on location. So we have these grand, majestic settings that you wouldn't necessarily have if the performance were on stage itself. And the idea of war and battle is something that continues on throughout the play. That yes, the men are returning from physical battle, but they're going to be entering into romantic battles and battles of wit. And this is perhaps one of Shakespeare's most witty plays. And we know that Hero and Claudio, who are younger and unattached, are a possible couple in a very typical way in the Renaissance, that this would be a marriage of superficiality and perhaps even of convenience, less so about emotional connection. Beatrice and Benedict are another possible couple. They're older and more experienced, and it's pretty obvious that they are equals in terms of wit. In fact, dare I suggest that perhaps Beatrice has the upper hand in many respects. We're introduced to Governor Leonato, who is Hero's father. And we know that just from A Midsummer Night's Dream that Hero's goal is to basically follow her father's will. She would be seen as property, and then eventually she would be married off and seen as property again. We're also introduced to Antonio, who happens to be Leonato's brother, who will be an important character later on in the play. Prince Don Pedro, who happens to be a friend, and I very much appreciate the casting in the film version we saw, that Denzel Washington, a black actor, was cast not as the villain, not as Don John, but as Don Pedro. Now, there's no reference to race or ethnicity in this play in the way there is to Othello. Kenneth Branagh made that decision, and I think Denzel Washington does a very competent job. Cast as, in this version that we saw, as our villain is Don John, who carries the title of the Bastard. He's a literal but also figurative bastard, and he is Don Pedro's brother, illegitimate brother, which could lead to some resentment, but there isn't any evidence in the text that Don John is ill-treated in any way. In fact, he even talks about how he enjoys just being a plain-dealing villain. The casting of this character, I'm not so sure about. I understand why they cast Keanu Reeves, because at the time, and perhaps even still today, we've got an A-list actor. And certainly in the 1990s, Keanu Reeves was younger, so he would have brought in a much younger audience. I don't know if he necessarily was the right fit for the role. And then we have the Constable Dogberry, who's supposed to represent our incompetent, cast by Michael Keaton of Beetlejuice. I think he does a very nice job of sort of giving us this Monty Python-esque interpretation of an incompetent. In some ways, you can see already that there are parallels with The Midsummer Night's Dream and other plays that we will see, that Shakespeare loves to give us a buffoon character. Yet, oftentimes within the buffoon character, there are words of reason or rationality that are uttered almost against their will. And that's what we get with Constable Dogberry as well. And Act Two is when we get the rising action, where Don John, and this is during a masquerade ball, very common theme of Shakespeare for people to wear facades or masks, not show their true self. So the masquerade ball works so nicely. Don John briefly tricks Claudio. And, we have a kind of Cyrano de Bergerac story here where Claudio is interested in Hero, and he mentions that Hero is unattached and that she is attractive, and also she is the only heir. In other words, she's going to inherit all the money. So all of the check boxes are basically checked off here. Don John briefly tricks Claudio into thinking that Don John, or I'm sorry, that Don Pedro, who was wooing for Claudio, because supposedly Claudio is not of the same status as Don Pedro, so Don Pedro was going to woo in his place, that Don John convinces Claudio that perhaps Don Pedro has ulterior motives. That was not the case at all. Notice, however, in the play that at one point Hero's father, Leonardo, tells her that if Don Pedro woos, please accept. So again, the idea of what would be the best match for his daughter. And this is foreshadowing for when later on in the play there are going to be unjust accusations against Hero, and we see how quickly it is that Claudio believes in these unjust accusations. And of course, we know that Beatrix and Benedict are our main couple. They're our major interests. But you might have noticed in Act 2 that Don Pedro, who is single, tries to woo Beatrice, and she lets him down easily, basically, that he's too expensive to wear for every day. In other words, they're all vying for a relationship, the single characters. And Beatrice, although she can come off as rather harsh and insensitive, this is a softer, kinder side to Beatrice when she lets down Don Pedro nicely. And of course, we also know that this means that Beatrice and Benedict, even though they doth protest too much, and that every time they protest to loving one another or to even liking one another, it's pretty obvious that they are very interested in one another. It almost reminds me of an elementary school romance where two people who are interested in one another, or two children who are interested in one another, basically tease each other and claim their hatred really as a mask. Note that mask idea again, for their interest. So, of course, part of the fun of the play is being able to see this relationship evolve and develop. And Act 3 is where we get the height of the conflict. Again, when you think about the pyramid structure of Shakespeare, Beatrice is convinced to love Benedict. It doesn't take much for her to be convinced. And of course, Benedict is convinced to love Beatrice at the ending of Act 2. And this happens through eavesdropping. And the idea of eavesdropping is a major theme, as well as the idea of rumors and how rumors can destroy an individual's reputation. And reputation is such an important idea in many of Shakespeare's plays. Considering the importance of reputation in this play, it's not at all surprising that Dogberry, the incompetent constable, is so concerned about his own reputation, where he's trying so hard to appear competent when he's really anything but. This, of course, Act 3, the height of the conflict, would be where Don John tricks Claudio about Hero's virginity. And of course, Don John has tricked Claudio before. He should be aware of this, but Claudio is representational of somebody who's very naive and very easily manipulated. And this leads us to the wedding scene, and it is a harsh scene, particularly in the production we saw, where Claudio rejects Hero for being unfaithful at their wedding in a public venue. So he's trying to embarrass and humiliate her. And at one point, Hero's own father, he strikes her and says that he wishes she were dead, that it would be better to not have a daughter or to have her dead than to have lost his reputation as father. Now, the friar, who's supposed to represent reason and rationality, he's not a very much developed character, but he comes up with the scheme of Hero being seemingly dead. Remember, this is a comedy, so she can't literally be dead. And that because we value that which we no longer have, notice how astute Shakespeare was in terms of psychology. In fact, I've oftentimes argued that Shakespeare was the first or one of the first psychologists. Since we seem to value what we don't have, if Hero is dead, then Claudio will begin to reconsider his thoughts about Hero. And one could say that at least Hero's reputation is dead, so in that way, it's dead. And this is where Beatrice and Benedict, of course, they've been convinced to love one another through eavesdropping. The assumption is that the other individual has professed their love, therefore they can relent and also profess their love. Their reputations of being independent and strong and not needing relationship are so important to both of them that neither one is willing to relinquish that. But once they have been given permission, in other words, once they learn that the other partner has supposedly admitted their love, then they feel that they can also grudgingly, albeit, admit that they too have feelings that are reciprocal. Beatrice at one point asked Benedict to kill Claudio for avenging Hero. If this were, or to kill Claudio to avenge Hero, and if this were a tragedy, this would happen. But this isn't a tragedy, so it's not going to happen. But it's one of the instances in which I think we can say that Beatrice has the upper hand, in that Benedict at first says that he doesn't want to do this. Remember that he and Claudio, friends and also fellow soldiers, they fought together in war. And Benedict is put in the position of choosing between a comrade or his future wife, which is what Beatrice will become. And he chooses his wife. Keep this in mind when we are reading Othello, because there will be a small twist, or maybe a big twist, to that. But even prior to this, think at the Masquerade Ball, where Benedict is speaking ill of Beatrice, and Beatrice is responding by speaking ill of Benedict. The thing is that Benedict doesn't know he's speaking to Beatrice because she's hidden under a mask. But Beatrice is well aware that she is speaking to Benedict because she's figured it out. So everything she says is deliberate in order to fall on his ears. So again, keep this in mind in terms of her strength. Notice she doesn't have a father figure in the play. So not only is Beatrice older, but she's not under the thumb of a powerful male figure. And I think that's important for one of the reasons why she's able to show such strength and independence. And then we end up with what would be considered to be a happy resolution. We know that Benedict threatens Claudio at this point, but it can't happen if we are going to have a happy ending. Dogberry, of all people, is the one who exposes Hero's innocence. So through his bumbling, almost accidentally, he's able to uncover the truth, that this was all a plot that was hatched by Don John. Perhaps because Don John is jealous, because he is the bastard brother, but as Don John freely admits, he enjoys being a plain-dealing villain. So he enjoys wreaking havoc and evil just for the sake of wreaking havoc and evil. Also keep this in mind when we start reading Othello and watching Othello and talking a little bit about a comparable character, another villain named Iago. At any rate, Leonato is willing to accept Claudio's apology, and note that Claudio is only willing to apologize for basically tarnishing and destroying Hero's reputation, and he thinks that she's dead at this point. Now Claudio feels regret, but he feels regret only after it's uncovered that Hero is innocent, that she is indeed virginal. And again, the importance of virginity, especially for female during this time period, can't be overstated. At least in public venues, the importance of virginity. I have always suspected that if Hero had not been found to be innocent, Claudio would never feel any kind of sense of contrition. And, of course, we need to have some comic mix-ups here that Leonardo will accept this if Claudio is willing to marry Leonardo's niece. And remember that we were introduced to the uncle earlier on in the play. And this niece, who is supposed to be the exact replica of Hero, really is Hero. So she comes back to life, so to speak. And this is very typical of Shakespeare, characters coming back to life. And Claudio and Hero reunite. Again, this might leave a bad taste in your mouth as a contemporary audience. And that Hero is so willing to forgive Claudio. At the time, this would be seen as a happy ending, though. And Beatrice and Benedict, even though they had previously pledged their love to one another, they're forced to publicly admit their love. In fact, there are handwritten notes, there's physical proof to show that ultimately they do love one another. And, tellingly, Don John will be punished, as is necessary, but only after the play proper. He will be punished later, because we want to end with a sense of joy. And I think this production really does give you a sense of the dance and the music that would oftentimes be associated with comedies. So some observations that I've got in the notes below. Of course, we have that happy ending with mix-ups and misunderstandings and some of the difficulties associated with love. It is set in reality, unlike Midsummer, and note that this play is in prose, complete sentences, rather than in verse or poetry. So again, establish the idea that it is in the real world. Hero and Claudio represent this kind of young, superficial love, a love of convenience, as I was suggesting. Benedict and Beatrice, an older, more mature love, but afraid to be vulnerable. And because of that, they're much more interesting than Hero and Claudio. Certainly the verbal sparring between the two, the verbal wit, is some of the best part of reading and watching this particular play. Don John, the plain-dealing villain, who is a literal and figurative bastard. The friar, as I had indicated, he serves to represent reason and rationality. The ways that rumors and hearsay can destroy reputation. Notice that in the wedding scene, the only man standing by Hero, or the only men really, are Benedict and the friar. We expect the friar, but Benedict shows that he has a depth of character that certainly the other men don't exhibit. Dogberry, yes, he is comic relief, but he also saves the day. He too is very concerned with his reputation. And Benedict, of course, is willing to kill Claudio for Beatrice. There's a wonderful speech where Beatrice says, "Oh, if only I were a man." In other words, that she can't act for herself because she's a woman. So this is either brilliant manipulation to get Benedict to act for her, or it's a lamentation about the lack of power that woman has in society, or perhaps both at the same time. Notice that this is a play of opposites. Beatrice and Benedict are in direct contrast to Claudio and Hero. Don Pedro is in direct contrast to his bastard brother, Don John. And as I had indicated, Don John will be punished, but only after the play ends. And think about how masks and facades are themes that we saw not only in the sonnets, but now are beginning to appear much more readily in the plays themselves. Now, I have some important quotes for you to think about, or at least I should say some interesting quotes. In Act 1, Scene 1, line 124, Benedict says that he's a ladies' man and that he loves no one. And of course, we have to wonder, why would he be saying that? And the reason, of course, is because he's trying to hide the truth, that he does love someone, Beatrice. Act 1, Scene 1, line 128. Beatrice says she doesn't want love, again, for the same reasons as that she does want Benedict, but she's afraid to admit it. Act 1, Scene 1, line 238. Benedict says he wants to live a bachelor. Again, methinks they doth protest too much. Act 1, Scene 1, line 274, Don Pedro thinks Benedict will ultimately change. Notice that at the very beginning of the play, one of Beatrice's first questions is, has Benedict returned? She never would have asked that, a return from war, if she wasn't exhibiting some interest in Benedict. Claudio wants Hero in Act 1, Scene 1, line 296, and as I suggested, he gives lots of reasons that would show that this is more a union of convenience than of romance. And Act 1, Scene 1, line 320, Dom Pedro takes that disguise as Claudio to woo Hero. Again, the idea of disguises and facades that thematically runs through the play. And untruths and misunderstandings. In Act 2, Beatrice says she'll have no husband. And again, we know that this is the last thing on her mind. Even more tellingly, Act 2, Scene 1, line 239. Benedict says he won't marry Beatrice. Nobody said anything about him marrying Beatrice. It's a little slip there. And then Act 2, Scene 2, line 33. This is where Don John the Bastard works with Borrachio to stain Hero's honor. If you know Spanish, borracho means drunk. And I think that works very well, the idea of being out of control when you're drunk and how evil can be also out of control. It's a theme that we'll see in many of Shakespeare's plays. Act 2, Scene 3, line 6, Benedict says he wants all graces in a woman. Of course, this is impossible. You can't find the perfect woman. So he's presenting a woman that just is not in reality to try to justify why he can't be with any woman. Act 2, Scene 3, line 136, Leonato finds a piece of paper that says Benedict and Beatrice on it. Notice how this kind of foreshadows some of the love notes that Beatrice and Benedict are forced to acknowledge at the ending of the play. Act 2, Scene 3, line 220, Benedict is too easily convinced to love Beatrice. In the version that we saw, the production, I love how they're able to use a simple stage prop, such as a folding chair, to illustrate how buffoon-like Benedict is. And again, we see the importance of maintaining reputation through all of this, and that they're only willing to admit love for one another if they think that their partner has exhibited and expressed love first. Beatrice in Act 3, Scene 1, line 107 is easily convinced to love Benedict because she does love him. Act 3, Scene 2, line 117, Claudio so easily believes Hero's infidelity. And, of course, we've seen this foreshadowed previously. Act 3, Scene 3, line 78, Dogberry says something quite interesting, that he believes that a watch should offend no one. Now, remember, he's a constable. This is absurd that a constable doesn't want to offend anyone. You have to offend somebody if you're a constable. Act 3, Scene 4, line 26 and also line 60. There's a little bit of dialogue going on with the womenfolk in the play. And Margaret, the serving woman, is using some body language, and she would be seen as of a lower station, so perhaps more appropriate for her to use some more body language than we might see with Benedict and Beatrice, talking about being stuffed. And, it comes from the idea of a stuffed nose, and then the idea is a woman stuffed when a man is on top of her. Of course, Shakespeare is not going to lose the opportunity for a sex joke. And the height of conflict that begins in Act 3 spills actually into Act 4, when Claudio publicly rejects Hero because he really wants to humiliate her, because he believes that he himself has been humiliated. And then Don Pedro, Don John, and Claudio all abandon Hero, which doesn't say much about their characters. It's only Benedict and, of course, the friar who are willing to stand by Hero. Leonato, her own father, actually rejects her. This is the importance of reputation, daughter's reputation and virginity, illustrated during this time period. And our lesson, or one of our lessons, is when the friar says in Act 4, Scene 1, line 210, that we value what we no longer have, and that's why he has this fake plan for Hero's death. For us to consider, too, that whether or not we are valuing that which we no longer have, and should we proceed in that manner. We see a lot of witty dialogue in this play. Act 5, Scene 1, line 150 is just one example. And we know that we're in Act 5, so we're going to have to come to some resolution. Claudio will forgive Hero, but only after he believes that Hero is virginal. Act 5, Scene 1, line 251. Benedict is reduced to writing basic love rhymes in Act 5, Scene 2, line 36. The idea is that this is what happens when you fall in love, is that you no longer have the ability to reason or to have rationality. He's writing the most basic of love rhymes. Earlier on, he's mocked by some of his friends that he's become overly concerned with fashion. He's become quite foppish. Again, some commentary about what happens when you fall in love. Act 5, Scene 4, line 70. That wonder now seems familiar. That might be one of the major themes of the play. And in Act 5, Scene 4, line 79, we get the payoff that Beatrice and Benedict are going to be together after we've seen this war of words and wit and love, all in prose. So as I had indicated, I wanted to give an extension on the first paper so that we could put some closure onto Much Ado About Nothing after the spring break. Next week is spring break, so I'll be posting that on our Moodle site. I hope you use the spring break to think about working on paper number 1 and also to begin with our next play, which happens to be Richard II. So what's left is our attendance question, which will be due via our class discussion form on the 15th of March, which is Friday. But of course, if you need additional time, let me know. As you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. So I'll be catching up on some of the discussion form responses, which might help you in formulating something like a first paper. Since I spent albeit a short amount of time talking about quotes, I wanted you to identify one of your favorite quotes in Much Ado About Nothing and indicate why it's one of your favorite quotes. Again, this is one of Shakespeare's wittiest plays, so you've got a lot of options here. But I think what you will find is after you read your classmates' selections, you'll have a good overview of much of the language of Much Ado About Nothing. So with that said, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And have a very nice spring break. Take care. Bye-bye.